Hey y'all, it's Miss Osborne. We're here with our first flip video for world history. Today we're going to be talking about the beginning of civilization. Early humans slowly spread from Africa to the other parts of the world, and they struggled to survive by hunting and gathering plants and nuts and animals. For hundreds of thousands of years they lived this way. Then some people started to learn to farm, and that's what we're going to really be talking about in this video, is our way as we make our way to the first civilizations. The essential standard that we're going to be focusing on in this video is WH.H 2.1. Compare how different geographic issues of the ancient period influenced settlement, trading networks, and sustainability of various ancient civilizations. Goldnog historians will explain and analyze various reasons for the rise of early river valley civilizations across the globe. As we're studying the distant past, the human story goes back to more than 1 million years ago, but much of the story remains a mystery. The time of prehistory means the time before the development of writing. In order to study prehistory, we must study artifacts or objects that people in the past made or used. These can be things like pots or fossils or architecture from the past. In order to understand their culture, we're using those artifacts to know about a society's knowledge, their art, their beliefs, their customs, and their values. For example, if a historian found a Bible in an old ancient architectural building, they might assume that that building was used as a temple. And that would tell us a lot about that society's culture. There's two different types of scholars. There's archaeologists and there's anthropologists. Archaeologists are the people who study human material and remains to learn more about people in the past, while anthropologists study fossils to learn about the human origins. They're slightly different. In the Stone Age, humans originated in Africa, but people began to develop and started to migrate out of Africa to adapt to different environments. They also started migrating out of Africa in search of food. The first prehistoric period is called the Stone Age, or the Paleolithic era, because most of the time during this time period, people used stone in order to make tools and other technological devices. The first part of the Stone Age is referred to as the Paleolithic era, or the Old Stone Age, and this lasts about 2.5 million years to 10,000 years ago. During the Stone Age, people mostly lived as nomads. These are also known as hunter-gatherers, or foragers. They moved from place to place as they followed migrating animal herds, and also the rotating crops in the area. They lived primarily in caves or rock shelters and in smaller groups. Hunter-gatherers relied on hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants, berries, nuts, and other foods. Men mainly hunted, while the women mainly gathered. The technology was also started to be used during this time. Technology doesn't necessarily always mean computers. Sometimes it can just mean tools that make life easier, such as hammers. The first tools were crude chipstones, but they also used wood and bone. As people moved to colder climates, they also started to use fire to cook their food and also to ward off danger. They also used animal skin clothing and built more long-term shelters. Anthropologists also believe that many early people practiced animism, which is the belief that all things in nature have spirits. As the Old Stone Age gave way to the New Stone Age, we started to see more sophisticated tools. The Neolithic era, also known as the New Stone Age, was characterized by advances in tool-making that allowed people to make more specialized tools. But a lot of the developments actually had to do with food. During the Neolithic Revolution, we saw the development of agriculture, or also known as farming, which allowed people to settle in one place. By settling in one place and also developing farming, they also began to domesticate animals to help with the farming process. Domestication means the selective growing or breeding of animals, plants, to make them more useful to humans. They eventually learned how to make tools from metal, which leads us to the Bronze Age. As many civilizations develop in river valleys, because river valleys were the ideal places because there was a lot of fertile land along the river. Because the rivers flooded pretty often, it kept the soil moist and available for farming. Early farmers continued to develop their farming techniques to increase farm production. The most significant of this was irrigation systems. Irrigation systems created canals and ditches that allowed streams to flow into their fields to water their crops. With irrigation systems, farmers could plant more and more crops and produce more and more food, which led to a surplus or an excess of food. With that surplus, these now civilizations could support larger populations and people survived for longer. With farming becoming more efficient, less people were needed to farm, and so people began to do other things. These things became known as a division of labor, and common jobs were things like metal workers, artists, or religious leaders. Division of labor led to an economic arrangement in which a worker might specialize in a particular task or a job. The food surpluses and the division of labor resulted in a major economic change from the old Stone Age to the new one. Early farming villages had traditional economies that were based pretty much on custom, tradition, and ritual. They mainly bartered or traded. As farming villages developed, food became extra valuable, and so leaders started to make decisions based on trade and feeding the growing population. Now, there's a couple characteristics of cities. As populations increased, small farming villages developed into cities. In order to become a city, they had to have 4 characteristics. The first one is that they were densely populated. There was lots of people living in that one area. They also had a tendency to be more diverse, with many unrelated, aka not the same families, living in the same place. They also were more formally organized than villages with marked boundaries, usually walls to protect from outsiders, and they also were centers of trade. The first civilizations developed in Tigris and Euphrates River Valley, also known as Mesopotamia, the Nile River, which were known as the Egyptians, the Indus River Valley in India, and the Yangtze River or the Yellow River Valley in China. A civilization is a complex and organized society, and it generally originates out of a large city. In order to be considered a civilization, though, there's 8 different characteristics of a civilization: developed cities, organized government, formalized religion, specialization of labor, social classes, record-keeping and writing, art and architecture, and public works. When we're talking about developed cities, we're really talking about the political, economic, and cultural centers of these areas. These cities were really social and economic institutions that were created as people began to travel, migrate, and trade. Organized governments looked a little bit more rough than what they look like today is probably the best way to put it. The early governments formed as a response to the needs. Governments really took care of the people. They created order and unity amongst the civilization. They created laws and they established systems of justice. They also gathered taxes so that they can keep the civilization nice and also provide goods and services that their people might need. Formal religious institutions also started to form. People tried to explain the world around them through religion. They often had ceremonies, rituals, or other forms of worship, and they sometimes sacrificed animals or offered foods to the gods' favor. Religious leaders often gained a lot of power by able to interpret the will of the gods. The government and religion were closely tied in early civilizations, and so religious leaders were very important decision makers in the government as well. Most of the civilizations were polytheistic, meaning that they had more than one god. Another characteristic of a civilization is specialization of labor. We talked about division of labor earlier, and as that increased, new jobs developed to meet the needs of the new economic, political, and religious institutions. One of the main jobs was artisans. Artisans were skilled craftspeople that devoted their time to basket weaving, carpentry, metalworking, and pottery. They were often in the upper classes of the civilization. Social classes also began to develop in civilizations as a result of division of labor. They developed specialized labor, and that created a social order that created more based on wealth, occupation, and influence. Rulers, priests, and nobles ranked the highest, while merchants and artisans were next, then farmers and unskilled workers, and then at the bottom of the social order were slaves. Civilizations also kept immaculate records. Records allowed the people to understand what was going on over time and also record their history. Writing developed as people needed a way to keep permanent records, and this was mainly done by a job called scribes. Each civilization developed a different system of keeping records. Most of the early writing systems were pictorial. However, as they wanted to express more complex ideas, they started writing in alphabets. We'll talk a little bit more about those later when we get into the early civilizations. They also started to develop calendars to keep up with the farming schedules that were based on the moon. Art and architecture is another important part of a civilization. The style and techniques that different artists used reflected all of the civilization's cultures. For example, the Egyptians used the pyramids. Many of these civilizations also started to create statues to gods, goddesses, heroes, and also their rulers. Art was used to reflect their power and the prestige. The bigger the art piece, the higher their power. Architecture, like temples, were often built to honor the gods and try to bring favor to the civilization. In addition, governments also were in charge of public works. They started building things like roads and schools and reservoirs in order to make sure that the people had enough supplies and were educated. The projects were mainly meant to benefit the city, to protect it from attack, or to ensure its food supply. Rival leaders often battled for power, summoned many cities, and started creating the first city-states. City-states was a result of battles that had happened and created a change in the civilization. A group of states or territories that come together that is controlled by one ruler is an empire. There's lots of factors that cause civilizations to change. The first one is environmental influences. Sometimes storms, floods, droughts, earthquakes, and volcanoes caused these civilizations to change or to disappear completely. Number two was a need for resources. As metals, stones, trees, and waters moved or the resources changed, the civilization also would have to change and adapt. Civilization also changed from cultural diffusion. Cultural diffusion is the spread of ideas, customs, and technologies from one people to another through trade, migration, and missionaries. Cultural diffusion spread certain technologies and allowed for people to expand their ideas. Expansion and warfare was also a cause of civilizations changed. As they grew, they started to need more land and resources for the people that they supported. Warfare was waged for the control of the land and people and resources. Victors often forced their way of life over those they conquered. Thanks for joining me for this slideshow. Make sure that you do your check for understanding questions, and I'll see you in class.